Indiana, we are simply passing through history. This is history.
Welcome to the Young Indy Chroniclers, a podcast about the making of the show, The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which first aired on ABC in 1992.
Kept thinking about what was Indiana Jones like as a young man. I came up with this idea of him seeing the world through the eyes of a soldier and a secret agent.
Over the course of our podcast, we're going to talk to a whole host of very talented people who either worked on this show or were there from the beginning.
We were able to shoot it on location in the real places where these events took place.
Oh, make it up as you go. Oh boy, that's great advice.
We hired some of the best European directors, a whole host of very, very talented people.
I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom.
And I'm Daniel Noah, and this is the Young Indy Chroniclers.
There's only one rule, Indiana. Stay alive.
Welcome back to the Young Indy Chroniclers, the one and only podcast devoted specifically and solely to the Young Indiana Jones television series and franchise. I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom, and joining me on this adventure of a lifetime is Mr. Daniel Noah.
Do not forsake me, oh my darling.
All right. Prestige television can mean many things. Sometimes the money is on the screen, other times it's in the executive's pockets. On today's show, we are thrilled to have a screenwriter who has worked on a number of different prestige television shows over the years, including Heroes, most recently Amazon's Citadel, Hannibal, Star Trek Discovery, and many others. To compare and contrast Young Indy with its worldwide scope and epic scale versus the big budget prestige shows on the streamers. Also, he worked on a project at LucasArts in the early aughts, and we'd love to talk to him about that. Jesse Alexander is joining us. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys. Big fan of the podcast. It's a high-quality show. Your interviews are great, and I feel that I have a lot to live up to because I've been so impressed as I've been listening to all your interviews with everybody. I'm just stoked to be here and talk about stuff. And don't forget Alias and Lost, which were very, before you guys were born, there were a couple cool shows.
Quite successful.
I wish we could say it was before we were born, but it was. I watched Lost religiously back in the day, and it was fantastic. Although I had to watch it on like my actual PC screen because there was some issue with our cable at the time, so I actually had to on dial-up internet because we still had dial-up internet at the time.
Jesse, I have to tell you, I ended up avoiding Alias because at one point dated a young lady who was a huge fan of the show. She was probably your number one fan. And that didn't go very well. And therefore I had this, negative reaction and I avoided it. So last night I went to Hulu or whoever has it. And I found the first episode you wrote, which was like the fourth or fifth episode of the first season, according to the credits, of course,
7 years ago, I was recruited to work for SD6, which I was told was a covert branch of the CIA. I was trained as a spy, warned not to tell anyone what I did. I thought I was working for the good guys, until I told my fiancé about SD6, and they had him killed. That's when I learned the truth, that SD6 is part of the very enemy I thought I was fighting. Now I'm a double agent, working with the real CIA to bring down SD6, where my only ally is another double agent, a man I hardly know, my father.
And I enjoyed it very much. And kind of, again, as we're talking about on this whole show, a little nostalgic for that period of television and that type of storytelling and the fact that it's all clearly shot in LA and on the Burbank Disney lot and out in the woods, but they're supposed to be in Germany and they're supposed to be in New York. And I was like, man, I miss television when it was like, you could just write, they go to New York Art Gallery and we just build a little art gallery set and we say it's New York and we're good. I'm glad because that, that's for sure the show I remember most fondly, as do, many of the folks who worked on it. And J.J. Abrams created an amazing culture there, which, was very much steeped in his Super 8 filmmaker background. And he just was very ambitious and understood filmmaking. And so he wasn't afraid of using effects and things like that. And it's very akin to George's approach to Young Indy, is there's a significant ambition involved and a real understanding by the creator in charge of the magic trick and the persistence of vision and how you can really use these images stitched together to paint a bigger story and make you think you're somewhere else when you're really just, on the Burbank lot or, in the tunnels under Disney or,
turning the parking garage into, a shooting gallery one day and a, vault the next week. And it was an amazing experience. So I think people who like Young Indy should check that show out just from that perspective and that angle.
That's great. Jesse, why don't we take a step back here? How did you first get involved with the industry, and what first brought you to Hollywood, I guess? Yeah.
That's a great question. I think, what first brought me, into filmmaking as a kid is my dad was a motorsports photojournalist and documentary filmmaker. So we always had cameras, and he was always shooting stuff and filming stuff. And in the best way, I would get all his hand-me-downs. So I had access to cameras and Super 8 cameras, which for people who don't know, was a kind of sort of like the video camera or the iPhone, where you can make your own movie in your house. And so I was part of the Super 8 filmmaker culture as a kid. And my friends and I, who were all nerds, all geeks, and it's funny, I was just talking to my son because we watched the new trailer for the Star Wars movie, where it is sort of like an Amblin homage.
I found something buried in the woods. What do you think it is? I think it's a lost Jedi temple.
And my son and I were chatting about that nostalgia for riding around on bikes, and like in Stranger Things. And I was like, I don't know if that really existed. And my son looked at me, and then I was like, oh yeah. My overweight nerdy buddies and I were like riding around on our bikes with cap guns and Super 8 cameras and our baskets on our bikes, and going around and making movies. So very much it was that era that JJ captured really well in his movie Super 8.
I have to help Charles finish his movie.
Be good for you to spend some time with kids who don't run around with cameras and monster makeup.
Could you close your eyes, please? And action!
And I always wanted to get into filmmaking and make movies. And my dad, a guy who had done sound work on one of his documentaries, ended up doing sound at American Zoetrope. And so when I was a kid, which was Francis Ford Coppola's company, and he had it with George, and I think it was after Star Wars came out, we got to go up there, and I saw him editing Dragon Slayer, which was an amazing classic movie, and got a tour of the Kerner Company.
Oh, wow.
Which you may be more familiar. It's Industrial Light and Magic.
Yeah.
And they were filming stop motion of the AT-AT walkers.
Wow.
And of the in Raiders, when in the big truck chase, there's a German Jeep that goes off like a cliff.
Yeah.
And so they had all that stuff set up there, and I saw that as a kid. And that was that moment where you're like, oh, this is a career. People do this. That stuff that I see on a screen isn't really totally magic or unattainable. These jokers are doing it up here. So I really, kind of committed to having a filmmaking career based on that. Like a total nerd and an ADHD undiagnosed kid, that's all I could really do. So that's all I really was dedicated to doing. And then I got into writing. I always was going to be a filmmaker, but I never really experienced writing until my freshman year of college, or sophomore year of college. I met this kid in the dining hall, and he had just gotten back from Christmas vacation. And he's like, I just sold a script with my friend. We just wrote a script and sold it to Disney. I was like, what? What the hell? Is that real? And we riffed out a script over lunch. We just met, and then we wrote a screenplay in a few days. And I learned how to write, and learned that writing a whole script, you just had to do it. It wasn't like this unattainable thing. It was something that we cranked out. And that friend was JJ Abrams, who people have mixed feelings about, which is too bad. About his work.
We'll respect the JJ.
Yeah, but he's, been a great friend and a longtime friend. And again, I got to see that person who actually did the job, and that it was real, and it really felt attainable. So that I was just super dedicated to doing that, and studied that in school, went to film school at NYU for a year, made another friend who actually became my agent. And we kind of started in the business together. So, and I, wrote movies for about 10 years, like selling specs, taking assignments, selling pitches. And it was the miracle years of Hollywood. It was, the kind of the last great, spec era, discretionary era where screenwriters sold spec scripts for millions of dollars, like JJ and Shane Black and Joe Esterhaus. And then studios were paying writers to just crank things out. So I did that for about 10 years and did really well and had a great time and wrote kind of a new Flash Gordon, adapted some video games, just wrote a ton of scripts. None of them were getting made. I was making a ton of money, but really frustrated with working in films because writers are not treated very well in film. And JJ, who'd been doing really well and just writing Armageddon and tons of huge stuff, he was just as frustrated.
Hi, Harry.
I have asked you repeatedly to call me Dad.
Sorry, Harry.
So he and his buddy Matt Reeves got into TV and had a show called Felicity and had a great experience there.
From the moment their lives touched,
Where are you going to college?
New York. What about you?
she knew she must follow her heart.
If you want to make this decision, I will not financially support it.
She's about to make the best mistake of her life.
Is it possible to be just friends with someone I have these feelings for?
You were my lesson.
It's about growing up
I had to learn.
and falling in love.
I'm kind of into Julie.
Scott Foley, Amy Jo Johnson, Scott Speedman, and Kerry Russell.
How could you lead me on? You made me fall in love with you.
How could you think that you're in love with me? You don't even know me.
And then JJ started to create Alias, and he said, like, dude, you got to come do this. It's so much better. We get to do whatever we want. We have the power. Like, we get to write things and make things. And I was stoked to get into TV where I could, learn how to crank stuff out. That was the main thing, is I wanted to just learn how to write more and write faster and see stuff made. So I got into TV in 2001 and just had a great run for 20 years or whatever it's been after that. So
That's fantastic. And you said you'd written some video games early on, and
yeah, totally.
Is this was that the period where you got on board with the transition over to LucasArts, or was it?
You know what's crazy is I've always been a gamer, and I was one of my great hooks when I was breaking in and selling stuff is I was that first generation that had played video games and had computers. So the pitches and the specs that I was writing and actually selling had a lot of these elements and components that the buyers were unfamiliar with. And I'd always been into games, and I wrote on a game for Activision called Apocalypse that Bruce Willis was actually in. I wrote that and did some very early stuff for Activision for video games. And I just always kept my foot in that. And it was during the, when was the other there? So we just had a writer's strike, and then there was a writer's strike before that. And I can't even remember what year that was.
2007 to 8 was the last writer's strike.
Yeah. I think that was another well-chosen time, right? Because wasn't there like an economic depression at that time? So that was a great time for a strike.
It followed it. So hopefully economic depressions don't follow Hollywood strikes.
Yeah, exactly. So in 2008, I was on a show called Heroes that was doing well at the time.
A good friend of mine once said it's more important to be honest with yourself and happy than popular. I think he got it right.
And it's a kind of a long, fun story, but anecdotally, when JJ was starting Alias and we were firing it up, he was looking for composers. I was playing video games, a game called Medal of Honor that I loved. I loved the soundtrack. I was like, who is this guy? Went online. I found this guy, Michael Giacchino, that had a website. I started listening to all his music, and I said, JJ, you gotta get this guy. He's incredible. So JJ's like, what? I'm like, yeah, he writes video games. And JJ listened to all the music and brought Michael in. Then years later, a contact of Michael's at LucasArts, they wanted to put together a writer's room of TV writers to try to break story for video games in the same way that writers break story for TV shows. So through that Giacchino connection, they reached out to me. I put together a room of great guys like Javier Grigio, Mark Swatch.
Sure.
There's a very amazing TV writer, and my buddy Aaron Colite, and we worked up at the ranch and we got to stay at the ranch, which was insane. And we worked on I don't even know if I can talk about what the project is because I'm under like so many NDAs. It's terrifying.
Just do it, Jesse. Just do it.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
Talk
the companies
about
have all changed now.
Oh my God, it's all changed. It was a really cool thing that had been George's idea. It never got done. And, it would have been awesome. It would have been rad. I got to ride a bike around.
Can you say what type?
What genre?
Yeah, what type of game was it?
You know what? George was a big fan of like CSI.
Interesting.
And I think George wondered, what would you do with that type of CSI in like a different genre, like science fiction potentially? What could that look like?
Interesting.
So I don't know, maybe something like that.
That sounds cool. I've heard about his CSI fandom though, that there was some Clone Wars episodes.
I've never heard that. That's
yeah. There are Clone Wars episodes that are CSI ripoffs. And Filoni has gone on record saying, like, George, he loves his CSI, so,
Wow.
Okay, Russo. You and Ahsoka should begin the interviews.
Well, part of him is here.
I don't think now is a good time to joke.
This is all that remains of Jakar.
His hand?
The rest of him exploded.
Because he was so close to the bomb?
Because he was the bomb.
Yeah, it was not attached to any of the existing properties though. It was an original thing. But it was an amazing opportunity to ride bikes around Skywalker Ranch and take pictures of each other and get into the warehouse and the archives and see everything and see the Macquarie paintings in person. And you're like, it's so small. I couldn't believe it. These amazing, images that had been like, the holy grail to me as a kid was the Macquarie concept art for Star Wars. And they're luminous. These paintings, like they unfold them and unwrap them with their gloves and they reveal this amazing thing. And they almost were like backlit. Like the colors in them was just so astonishing. So, we got to see all the cool stuff in the warehouse. And then this is so embarrassing. It's so stupid. We were kind of walking around the ranch and it was over the weekend and we see this Mercedes coming up the road and the guy who was our host is like, it's George. And we're like, what do we do? He's like, hide. And there was like a group of like 5 of us and we run and we like hid in the bushes because we were like, are we supposed to be here? Are we not supposed to be here? And George like drives by in his Mercedes and he goes and he parks at the house and he gets out and he went up and it was when he was writing Red Tails. So it was like he had time to like get and write Red Tails. And like I took a picture, like a long distance. It was like a full surveillance shot of George. Like so that was an embarrassing overshare on my part.
Wow, that's awesome.
I think it's such an interesting time in Lucasfilm that doesn't get talked about a lot. As I think a lot of people just kind of presume after the prequels he was just kind of winding down until he eventually sold. But it's always fascinating to hear about these projects he was still working on in 2008. It sounds like maybe 2009 was when you were up there. And it sounds like he was still really moving full steam ahead on so many things.
100%. That's correct. And I loved your interview with Jonathan Bressman. I think. Like for sure, he really painted the culture there in the way that I recognize and that it's been explained to me. And he was spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
George was spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he was making stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like he was generating screenplays. They made that whole animated movie on his own dime.
Yeah.
A goblin king, that's me, wants to take over the forest.
Sound the alarm.
Yeah, right!
To stop him, they'll need magic.
Like a potion.
Great idea. Courage.
I'm sorry, but I have to do this. You okay, little guy? Oh, good. Bye.
And a hero who's taking matters into her own hands.
I was expecting more.
Uh-oh. Strange Magic starts January 23rd. Rated PG.
And they were funding all these games that maybe weren't selling as much. And they were spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
You were weak when I found you.
Use your wits and fists. In
An all-new adventure. Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings feel more like Indy than ever. Where is she? Obey me, or she dies, apprentice.
Where are you off to next, Mr. Voller?
Well, with any luck, I'll be spending April in London.
Honor.
Vengeance. Justice.
Power. Time for war has come. Choose your side. Join the battle. Star Wars, The Old Republic.
I'm solo. I'm Han Solo.
Because George wanted to, and it was his clubhouse, right? It was whatever he wanted to do, he could. And then, you know, I think there was, I don't actually know how it all went down, but I think there must have been a conversation where somebody like put up a graph or a chart, and I was like, you got to sell this thing, bro. It's the only way you get out of this one. And I think that's how all that happened. But there's so much in that archive of that Disney owns that I wonder when we'll see the light of day. I know they put that animated movie is out there. You can see it, I guess. They released that. But, you know, all those banked scripts for all those other Star Wars shows and the games and all that kind of stuff. They have so much cool IP that George created during those years that hopefully at some time someone will figure out a way to put it out there.
Catch a deep breath. It'll be the last fresh air you'll get for a while.
Cargo lane cleared for descent to level 1313.
The rings aren't on Coruscant. They're underneath it. It's a long way down. It gets a lot dirtier where we're headed.
Well, you'd think you could at least do a book of the underworld scripts, right? I mean, I remember in the 90s, there was a whole industry of like alternate art and alternate drafts of Star Wars that were just published, and you could go to bookstore and buy them, right? Like they didn't make any of those things, but it was worth something to the audience to purchase. So yeah. I hope at least some point just sell the scripts, you know, as a book, as a collection, whatever.
100%, because that's another thing is all the concept artists that they had employed up there cranking stuff out. Like that was one of the best things about walking around there. You would see this concept art that was so incredible. And it's, you know, when these Star Wars books come out, you get to see some of it, but they must have, you know, so much art that has not been shared and seen that for sure I would buy one of those Dark Horse books for $50 or whatever that is filled with that stuff. So hopefully we get to see all the hard work, because they had the best craftspeople, you know, on all those movies and all those projects, you know, some of the best craftspeople in the industry working on all that stuff. And it'd be amazing that we could see more of their work.
It really would. And, you know, there's so many areas of Lucasfilm like I want to learn more about as well. But I suppose because this is an Indiana Jones podcast, I'll ask specifically about your time there. Like this would have been around the time where the DVDs for Young Indy were coming out. Obviously it's you would have glanced at it and it, you know, wouldn't have stuck in your memory particularly, but do you have any recollections of any Indiana Jones related content that either for the Young Indy or maybe even for I guess Crystal Skull was coming out around that time, or was there any concept art for Indy 5 that you ever laid eyes on or anything along those sorts?
You know, I don't think I did. This is a kind of a funny story. This is and knowing that Daniel does edit these, I will tell it and then he can decide if he wants to clip it. When I was up there was an amazing moment that happened. Like the contact that first of all, Ralph McQuarrie was there that day. Wow, so all the artists were flipping out that Ralph was there. But the really funny story was George had been walking down the hallway and again, this was like in 08, right? Like, you know, let's just say it was 08. So George is walking down the hallway in like the publishing area and someone like a younger person or somebody comes out of an office and comes up and asks him a question about Dark Jedi.
Don't waste my time, 88. Tell me who killed my father.
Patience. He is a Dark Jedi.
Jedi.
Dark Jedi.
So Dark Jedi is a huge component of all the expanded Star Wars books, right? Like that's a big deal.
In all my years, I've only known Dark Jedi, never one from the light side. Somehow I expected more.
And George goes, Dark Jedi? What are Dark Jedi? what's a dark Jedi? And someone tries to explain to him. He's like, that's impossible. You can't have dark Jedi. A dark Jedi don't exist. Like, they're Sith. Like, what's a dark Jedi? That's not even a thing. And then whoever he was with was like, hey, George, we got this other meeting we got to go to. And they like let him off down the hallway. But it was so amazing that he had this like moment of interaction with that expanded part of the IP and didn't really have a connection to it or understand it. And that just lines up so much with all my experiences in Hollywood on every big thing I've ever worked on is like, lack of communication or miscommunication or something like that. So that was kind of an amusing anecdote up there that Daniel can cut out of our conversation.
No, we're keeping it because that's a great story. There's a clip that's I'm sure you've seen. It's gone around the internet where Seth Green is in the room with George and the writer, and they ask him about Mara Jade.
As the creator of Mara Jade,
Wait! I am not the creator of Mara Jade, and I want you to get out of this office right now.
I'm sorry, Zed.
No way.
You brought you brought it on yourself.
I don't want you here.
I'm so sorry, George. I didn't think it would go like this.
Out.
Zed, I got your voucher.
Out! There.
I'm sorry about that. I'm so sorry. We'll have him burned and
I don't even know who that guy is.
I love that. I love that. I love George. He was, again, he was my idol. He was, the reason I got into the film business, and I just love him so much and just have so much respect for him and just think he's just incredible.
Yeah, and relating this all back to Young Indy, because it's when I mean you've watched some of the episodes, you're a fan of our podcast, of course, but when looking at it, like it does seem to paint a certain picture of what the ethos was at Lucasfilm at the time. And you talked about this a bit previously, just how much money they would spend on each project, and it was always under that belief or hope or aspiration that one day they would earn a profit on it. Maybe it would be in a couple of years, but at some point, or through an ancillary market or whatever, like it could turn a profit. But when you look at Young Indy now today and being part of an industry yourself, like how do you view it in relation to a lot of these prestige shows that you've worked on?
I love Young Indy, and I loved it when it came out. I didn't watch it on the air because I actually didn't really have a TV back then, and just to avoid watching TV because I was so focused on my career. But then I got them on DVDs, I think was the first time that I saw them, and I loved them so much. And, it's really interesting that you say, that it was made with this, again, it was made because George wanted to make it, right? Yeah. Like that's the thing about that show. And it's the thing to remember about so much of anything that George really did is that he did whatever he wanted to do. And that's, I think, what makes Young Indy so special is it was made for an audience of one. Right? It was just made for George. Like sure, we can say, it was made for these different audiences that they were going to find, and maybe one day it would find, but it was just George making something that he wanted to see and he wanted his kids to see and to try out toys that he wanted to play with and techniques that he wanted to play with and share subjects that he was interested in that, he didn't think people paid enough attention to, and work with filmmakers he was excited about. And, in the best way, it was just made, I think, for all the best creative reasons. And it's one reason why I think it's such an anomaly. It stands out because it really wasn't made for a targeted audience, right? Like people talk about it as if it's a kids show. That's not a kids show, like that. The violence and the maturity of stories and the history of it that's in it, and the sexuality that's in it, that is not a kids show. And yet the sort of the element of kind of retro nostalgia, old school way that the characters interact and talk, and it's like, well, it's not exactly for a super mature audience either, right? It's made for George.
Well, listen, I have an idea. What did you say you were getting off? Bayswater? Why don't I get off with you?
I beg your pardon.
I could come home with you. Maybe have a cup of coffee, and then maybe...
You must be mad.
It's a show for George, right? And I think that it's so also incredibly ambitious in the scope. And George used the techniques that he had seen in early Hollywood, the Roger Corman techniques of buying stock footage and, hey, I've got a piece of a movie here and another piece of a movie here. Let's use those to expand our own movie. And he wasn't afraid to do that. He wasn't afraid to use those, other footage elements. And he certainly was excited to try out new techniques of special effects. And he also understood, that if you film one scene in Australia, they can walk through a door and the next scene you can film it in London. The audience is not going to know. Like, he just understood the medium in such a great way that he wasn't afraid of being ambitious with it. And I think that's something that you see with for me with J.J. Abrams, is someone who was the same way in terms of his ambition, the way he approached Alias. So I really think that Young Indy is it's an amazing jewel. And I think all of us sort of wish, if only, the resolution had been a little higher, if only there was a way that we could, that show could live in its archival glory and just higher res, and maybe one day there'll be a way that AI can go in there and fiddle with it. But it just was such a special anomaly that I think that, again, you will not see that show's kind again. It just was so unique and made for all the right creative reasons. And the techniques that it employed are the kinds of things that really need to be dictated by the highest person on the food chain. Needs to say, yeah, that's good enough, or we're going to go here and we're going to do that and we're going to go over here. And then to have an amazing person like a Rick McCallum to be able to execute that vision and be so dedicated to supporting George's vision that they're not going to be undermining it at different places. So it just is really a unique treasure, and people should appreciate the stuff that they like in it and be amused by the stuff that they don't, and not judge it through a modern lens at all. It really is unfair. I was watching, I watched a few episodes before this. I watched Hawkman, Daredevils of Desert, Oganga, Hollywood Follies, Scandal. And I started judging it like, well, why isn't he talking about that experience that he had over here? And why am I not tracking him emotionally? Because he just went through. And I was like, that's not fair to be judging it on that, through that modern lens of how I tell a serialized story or what my expectation is. Because they didn't know how to do that. And they didn't have a system structured where the writers were able to do that. So I really caught myself, being judgmental about it inappropriately.
Well, I think, you're absolutely right there. I remember the first time I watched it on DVD as well, I had a similar kind of, grudging view of it, where it was like, this doesn't seem to be, I kept wanting to follow up on the previous episode in some way, and then it never did, and it was always like a hard reset. And yet, as time goes on, I've just come to appreciate that so much more. And that's also kind of what George has always done. The Star Wars films, in my mind, Mark Hamill in those three films is just some of the best acting you've ever seen. But it's because every movie, it's a hard, this is a new Luke Skywalker that you have not seen before. You can connect the dots if you want to, but we're starting him at a different place than where you left him.
Luke's crazy. He can't even take care of himself, much less rescue anybody. A Jedi Knight. I'm out of it for a little while. Everybody gets delusions of grandeur.
And I think with Young Indy, it is very much the same thing. It's like each episode, you're starting with him at a very different place.
You did brilliant work in the capture of Damascus.
Actually, I'm supposed to be staying down the hall with the Jacksons, but they don't seem to be home.
No, they're not. They're in Europe.
We've been through together. Have you ever known me to lose a bet?
Ankara, but you would never admit it.
Well, I found a way to meet Kamal. Wasn't my idea.
Don't be modest. I'm sure you enjoy tying women up.
And now we're going to take him through a completely different emotional arc than he had before, which is why I've said this before on the show, but I think it is in many ways the most anthology kind of show I've ever seen, where it is just like every episode could just be something entirely different than the previous one. And you'll just never know what genre, what time period, what type of a show you're going to get. But I also think you bring up a really good point too about how George, he's making these shows for himself, but it's also he had enough of a business savvy. I think Roger Corman, who I adore, but he always made stuff being how do I make money? And then it's just art kind of was and he was an artist as well, but like his primary focus was like, let's figure out a way to make some money off this. And then we could sneak in some art in there, if we want to. Whereas George was always just like, I want to make this thing. Let's hire some people who can figure out how to make money on it. It's like the drive was always the creative. And then how do we do all this other stuff too?
Going back to what you said about the continuity though, Jesse, I'm going to take a moment to do something we never do on this show, which is praise George. But if you look at the movies I think we universally love, right? Like obviously there's some controversy around George Lucas and his body of work, but if you look at the original Star Wars trilogy and if you look at the Indiana Jones films, they all follow that same model of there's continuity, but not slavish continuity. And there is a sort of reset tonally and story-wise between each movie.
What are you trying to do? Scare me? You sound like my mother.
This is an obsession, Dad. I never understood it. Never. Neither did Mom.
I don't believe in magic, a lot of superstitious hocus pocus.
You betrayed Shiva.
Now, you can see the magic of the rock. You bring back.
Yes. I understand its power now.
And in all those cases, they were sort of universally accepted and beloved. And that's sort of part of the reason. And I think as we've seen some of these properties try to get continued or remade, even other properties, there's movies out right now that are continuations of old franchises. There's this desire to have that connectivity and to tie these things together and maybe almost to their detriment. I think I hear you completely. And, when you're watching Hollywood Follies, he maybe should be referencing his experience on Broadway a little more, right? Or all that. It's like, yeah, it doesn't feel like the guy who just worked on the show is now producing this movie, right? But it does feel like this sort of archetypical proto Indiana Jones figure that we've developed is having these experiences, right? And you could jump in, and it's not important that you saw Scandal in 1920 to watch Hollywood Follies. And that's the Hollywood Follies' benefit.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, actually. I really, I like, the thing that you're talking about here, because it's a really weird hybrid. And it's interesting because George hadn't really done television. I don't even know how much television he'd watched at that time. Yeah, because they're such different mediums. And I think it's something that people really forget. And I think it's something that has really hurt a lot of the expanded Star Wars content and Marvel content as well, is that, as soon as they shifted all the movie people over into the TV space, and they're like, we've been making movies, we know how to make TV. And they're just different mediums, and there are different interactions and experiences that the audience has with them, right? Like a Star Wars movie, it comes out and a few years later, you see another Star Wars movie. So where a show, it's this thing every week, right? You're seeing it every week. So I think that's something really jarring in those young indie movies. Now, now that I think about it, is that every week it's such that jarring shift to what could have been a totally different movie, completely legitimate story, totally legitimate experience. But because you're seeing it in a more condensed space, and the other part of TV is it's all about character. As much as you want to talk about Game of Thrones, blah, 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 TV are these smaller screens that are in your house, that they're in your living room, and that you build a relationship with those characters, an emotional connection to those characters, and you've got to be tracking those characters emotionally and the audience's relationship to them. And I think that that's something that those young indies didn't do because of their more cinematic ambition.
There are a lot of rules that you have to conform to in order to develop a television show that we have not conformed to. It's very plot-oriented. TV shows have to be very character-oriented. It's very slow-paced. Television has to be very fast-paced. The only thing I want to do is make a very good show that has value. That, to me, is important.
So I don't know if it totally works as that. Again, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't totally work in that way, and yet it works as this other incredibly special thing that it was, where he's like hanging out at Hollywood Follies and he's not, oh yeah, I should tell you guys about when I just mowed down like 60 like Zulu conscripts with a machine gun in the desert, you know? And he's like, oh, I'm feeling so awkward around these Algonquin writers. I'm like, what the hell, bro? What the hell, bro? Like, what, you just went through the craziest shit I've ever seen. Like, you gotta, you know, so that there's those moments of cognitive dissonance, I think. And I think it's in ludonarrative dissonance is something you call it in games, where there's just sort of a disconnection between what the actual experience is and then what's being presented to you. Again, it just, none of this is being negative. Like, I love that show. I've got Indiana Jones crap all over my, you know, office here. Like, it was so ambitious and so special, and in a way that very few shows are anymore. You know, back in the day, there was a Covert Affairs where they, you know, it was a spy show and they went around the world. Blood and Treasure tried to do the same thing, you know, going around the world and being ambitious about, like that in the same way. But unless you have someone like George, you know, who is really driving that at the top of the food chain, or a 800-pound gorilla like a JJ or a Guillermo or somebody like that saying this is what we're doing, and no one wants to take that person on, it's very hard to do something special in television, particularly, you know.
You know, Jesse, I'll ask the direct question here. I know that all three of us here know the answer to this, but for the listeners out there who maybe aren't in the industry, if you were to make a show and you were like, every week we're going to go to a different part of the world and we're going to actually produce the show there, you know, like how quickly would the executives show you the door?
Well, that's the thing, right? Probably it's really interesting because it just depends which executives and where you're going. And I just came off a show called Citadel, which was on Amazon Prime, and it was a spy show.
8 years ago, you two were Citadel's top spies, but we were double-crossed by one of our own, and your memories were erased.
And it went to other places around the world, and it was not necessarily creatively successful for all the reasons that have nothing to do with anything, like, you know, good or constructive. But that show, and I got to give it up for Jen Psaki, who runs Amazon. She understood, hey, we're expanding into these other markets around the world, and we have money that we're making in these other places that we want to do something with. Let's create a show that goes around the world and then create spin-off shows in those other territories that are made by the best local talent in those areas that are that fall under this narrative umbrella, that this creative universe that we're building, and yet those other territories can create the type of content that works in their space. So, you know, there's a show, I think the Italian version of Citadel's coming out. There was a show, a Mexican version, a German version, a French version, all these different shows that were going to support this big global vision, as well as then Citadel went to other territories around the world to film, but it's so expensive. And unless you're going with like a micro crew, and it's one reason I love this movie, The Creator, that came out, that a lot of people
love that movie.
What about the others?
What do you mean?
They're my family.
They're not people, Maya.
They're not real. This is real. You and I are real. It's okay. I'm going to heaven.
No.
I'll meet you there.
No, no.
I'm going because of you.
I don't want you to go. I want to be with you. Please.
You know, that the production approach to that, I see that as the future and as so visionary and just so impressive. And it's, I want to say, is it Edwards?
Gareth Edwards directed the film.
Directed it, yeah. And he's one of those guys that has a knowledge of visual effects and cinematography and how to make a genre movie. And because he was leading that project, they were able to go with a much smaller crew, much less financial burden, and shoot on these locations, and then also shoot the movie first and cut the movie first and then do all the effects work later. So you weren't having this, parallel creation of all this effects work that was simultaneously draining the budget and was stuff that probably wouldn't end up on screen anyway. So I do think that there's a lot of techniques that can be used to get the economic expense down, and a lot of desire from a lot of these streaming channels to have that global audience and expand in these other places. But I think you're going to have to find a way that, my culture is not your costume, right? You're going to have to find a way to do it authentically with the creative teams in those locations and work with some of the best filmmakers there. So that's a long way of saying all the shit that I just said is so crazy and so involved. It goes back to what Peter's saying being true. They would just show you the door and throw you out, I think, probably, at the end of the day.
I find it so interesting that, the creator costs about 75 million, roughly, maybe 85, I think, somewhere in that range. And it's kind of was part of their marketing was like, we made this for such a cheap budget. And, they did so much with what they had.
I wanted to reverse engineer the VFX shots. Instead of designing the film first, I really wanted to go around the world and go on the journey these characters go on. We got some money to go and do a location scout. We go film these amazing places and just catch monks walking amongst the ruins in Cambodia, or people just driving on a moped past us as we travel somewhere, with no tracking data, with no markers, and just gave it to ILM and said, can you turn these into robots?
Citadel, obviously Hollywood Reporter is notoriously wrong on figures like this, but supposedly those 6 episodes were $300 million. And that is significant. Young Indy, somewhere in the range of 800,000 to 1.5 million per episode. And that is a model that I don't think exists anymore for a television show. Even adjusted for inflation, we'd probably be talking 5 million an episode today. The idea of going, to not just 3 countries, that's the thing. Game of Thrones, they'd go to their 3 kind of standard locations, Ireland, Croatia, and maybe Iceland or whatever. And that would be their main filming locations for all the seasons. Indy was each week. They're spending 3 weeks of production in a different country. Within that budgetary constraints, it's truly remarkable, and I can never quite circle that square of how that model worked, but also how current executives and current studios don't employ a similar model.
Well, what's interesting is the model didn't work. It didn't create a successful TV show, but not for the budgetary reasons.
Yeah.
So in other words, because the figures they released by the end of the Young Indy project, which was $4 million, each of the films that was 22. So it's $88 million for the entire thing, right? Less than the cost of a movie at the time. Yeah. It's the cost of the creator today, right? But you could make a different show that's theoretically creatively successful, avoiding some of the problems Jesse's identified for that amount of money, but it's not done. So why is that?
Citadel too, a big part of their marketing was we're doing all of these different shows. And so in a way it is creating those ancillary markets that George was hoping to employ himself with Young Indy, with the merchandise and with, the books. Didn't exactly pay out for him, but it seems like it's very baked into the Amazon model of this is the only way we can afford to do this, is if we make so much of it that eventually we will break even.
The streaming model works on such a different financial side of things, and why Apple and Amazon are even in the TV business or spending money in the TV. Talking about budgets and things like that and why people are making them and it just is not, just the longer I've been in the TV business for 20 years, it just, you never know why, what the financial incentives are and how much things really cost and the way that they move money around and the way that they use amorts and money from different places and all of that, so much of it is just really about like, you know, will and desire to do a thing at the highest level of leadership, and then having creative leadership on whatever it is that will be able to maintain consistency. And when you're doing a serial, for sure, you really want writers to be at the highest level of that creative process so that you can arc out those 8, those 10, you know, episodes that things usually are now, and have a group of people, of writers that are able to really collaborate on that scripting process so that those stories do make sense and do track, you know, with each other. And the showrunner, the TV showrunner is a very special creature because it's a creative person that also understands some of the economic challenges of making a show. So you understand the format that you need, how many action scenes, how many scenes of this, what a location is going to do. Oh, if we're doing 10 episodes, let's have 2 cutouts that are, you know, smaller episodes. Let's spend money up front, spend money at the end. That those, you know, those creative showrunners like a JJ or, you know, a Damon or somebody like that really understand that, how that model works. And I think it's one of those challenges now where you're really seeing that shift to more producer, director, executive driven leadership of shows where that, that skill set is maybe not as included as it maybe should be, and could be really helpful, I think, actually, in terms of, you know, allocating finances in a way that where content is on the screen and making the content track from episode to episode over a season. Because it's just, it's really, really challenging. Writing serials is really hard. And that's another thing on Young Indy is they weren't really set up to do it in the way that we do it. They were very much following the UK model of TV where, you know, writers come in, they break story for a very short period of time, and then the writer goes off and generates the script, and that individual then, you know, works with whomever to rewrite it. Whereas the serialized model that I grew up in starting in 2001, it was a really collaborative room of writers where you're all breaking the stories together, and then often you're all writing on the scripts together as a team. So it's one reason why a lot of those shows do track and, you know, emotionally and plot wise and feel cohesive, is because there was a real team focused on doing it together.
I wonder if you could give like a bit of context here for the listeners out there who, again, maybe aren't in TV space. Like George famously, like he pushed a lot of the production outside of the States. He was notoriously non-union in relation, you know, he'd hire international casts and international crew often because he had some issues with the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild early on in his career. Valid issues too, I might point out. But I guess like when you're approaching, when you were on a show like Alias or Lost or whatever, like, I wonder if you could talk about like what were some of the budgetary issues or budgetary limitations isn't the right word, but like what was some of the stuff that was in your mind as a writer that potentially Young Indy didn't have to worry about, didn't have to think about, given George's, you know, modus operandi with the way he was producing films and TV.
Yeah, well, obviously we would have recurring cast and we would have standing sets. And then you would have a couple days that you could shoot off the lot, you know, or go somewhere else and shoot to get outside of your sphere. And on Alias, we were really lucky to have a great producer who was in sync with JJ, great line producer, and she was willing to really get creative with us in terms of finding, you know, we were on the Disney lot, places on the lot that we could redress, or, you know, places nearby that we could get to go redress those as different countries or different places. And then you also know, if I have 8 days to shoot and I've got, you know, an 8-day shoot. I think we even had shorter day shoots on Alias, but you also know if you're going to do a fight, it's going to eat up, you know, a significant amount of time, and you can only do it in so many days. for me, that I think there's so much value in those constraints and those restrictions. And very often creatives do their best work when they're in that type of situation. I did a show called Hannibal. And literally the first day I got there, we had a meeting with the studio and they cut our budget by $1 million. And it was like, what? And, Brian and I were like, this is impossible. What can we even do? But we had to put our creative hats on and come up with a new way to design the format that would focus on different things and keep the things that Brian Fuller cared about. And I think it ended up making, a very special TV show that resonates with a lot of audiences. So I do think that there's a lot of value in having those restrictions. And I really have not been on a show where having more money and time made the show any better, and has actually been the opposite in a number of cases. When I jumped on the second season of a show called American Gods, that had gotten itself really in the hole financially. And it was unclear if it was even going to come back. So a big part of my mandate was to try to find a way to make the show that was good enough, close enough to what the amazing season one, but was, more affordable and could continue. So I created, standing sets and an idea that there was a chain of restaurants around the United States. So, like Howard Johnson's was an old restaurant franchise, so that our characters could go to these restaurants that, in the US, and it could just be our one set that we would redress every week. And I created different pairings of the characters. So I would have multiple storylines I could cut to with my cast that I had, my recurring characters. So that I could pair them up in different, in different groups. So I could have an ABC story and cut to these different characters that I, owned.
When people first came to America, they brought us with them. Forgotten gods, a new life in a new land. There are new gods growing in America. Now they want to destroy us. And if you think otherwise, you are fooling yourselves.
There's a lot of craft involved in making a show, and that allows you to get it done on time and on budget, and with the right approach can be creatively effective and resonant. And again, they just, they had their own constraints on Young Indy that I can't even imagine. Like, what were Rick McCallum's constraints, on that show? Because they were real, obviously, right? They had, like, we only have so many extras, and we're here in this, section of Mozambique or wherever they were filming, or Malta, and how are we going to use it? And so, like, the lessons that he must have learned on that show about how to then go produce like another version of a show like that. He must have learned so many amazing lessons from that. And it's unfortunate that show like didn't continue, because you do learn, right? Very often every TV show, you don't really figure out what the show is until midway through season one. You really start to figure out, oh, this is what we do well. These are the characters that resonate. These are the stories that don't work. And you need time to figure out what it is that your show is and what works well. And I think if Young Indy had continued, it would have only gotten better and better as it went on, as they really figured all that out, figured out the strengths and stretches of their cast and their crews and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, especially you look at something like Attack of the Hawkmen, which you watch for this, it's like, that's like, I think they really hit the note there in such a great way. It's one of my favorite episodes, but that's one of their last episodes they produced. And it's interesting to look at how, like, the Clone Wars, which is George's next big foray into television, it starts in a similar kind of anthology format.
Nadab! Congratulations on passing the trials. I'm sorry the war prevented me from seeing your training through to the end.
You were Mistmaster, but it is an honor to finally serve beside you as a knight.
After kind of the first initial order, which was 2.5 seasons, like George drop that idea. And maybe that was because of pressure from the writers or whatever, but also maybe it was just because he realized himself, it's like, this actually isn't working as well as I thought it would.
You've lied to me. How many other lies have I been told by the council?
And so I wonder if Young Indy also would have gotten to that stage in like a season 4 or so, where he was just like, it is better to kind of like build and do continuing story arcs.
Well, I think he did. And I think you see it in a couple ways. I think when you look at the 4 TV movies, right, he realized Old Indy was not working. He made that choice right before that it ended. And then talking to Jonathan Hales, which the listeners will have heard by now, he talks about the plan for the next story arc. So there was thought being put into a new story arc instead of like circling back and doing more World War I and all that. So that may have been their recognition as well as, hey, what if we advance the character, we go into the 20s and start over? And certainly he presented that story to us in a fairly linear fashion. It doesn't necessarily mean it was going to be produced that way, but he had in his head, like, he's going to go here, this is going to happen, then he's going to go here, and he's going to work his way in. So it's quite possible that they did realize that issue, but it was just too late. The show was over, the money was gone, and we had to move on to Star Wars.
I think that's very interesting to hear. I think that's super insightful because the Young Indy, they were making movies, right? They were really making movies, and as much, sure, they stitched them together to turn them into movies, but it was just that anthology type of show with the filmmaking approach they were doing was more movie based, and there really can be that switch where people who make movies come to TV thinking they're the same, but it really isn't the same. And it's interesting that I had forgotten that about that Clone Wars series, that how it did pivot like that, and then became the thing that all of us loved. Tracking. I'm gonna start crying when I think about Ahsoka leaving Anakin and going away. Like, Jesus, that was so devastating, because we'd emotionally been on that journey with them versus those more anthology style one-off episodes, a lot of which were super cool, but it didn't allow you to get emotionally connected to those characters and go on that journey with them.
Yeah, so in many ways, the Young Indy we have is kind of analogous to that. It's like we see the potential for what the full vision could have been, but we just don't have it. And that's the tragedy. I think that's why Daniel and I find it infinitely interesting to talk about. It's always that tantalizing, like, what if?
Well, and it's Indiana Jones. Like I always say, you got to take a step back. We talk about Indiana Jones, talk about Star Wars. These are some of the most successful, interesting franchises that have ever been created. And in the case of Star Wars, there's 50 hours of scripts we've never read that exist that George Lucas, produced. In the case of Indiana Jones, there are these other scripts that track the character becoming an archaeologist into the 1920s in the jungles of South America. These things exist. They're on paper somewhere, or they're on audio tape in story conferences. It's not just my imagination. And I'm incredibly curious. I'm craving to know what these stories would have been. And I feel like it's the most natural thing in the world, and everybody should feel that way. But
well, and again, it's back to the difference in the TV models. Like Jesse, I'm sure that in your experiences, like, I'm sure you have thoughts about like maybe a next season of a show that you're working on or whatever, but you don't really start working on it until you get the green light, and then you're in the room, and then you start talking. George is always like, so we're going to plan out for like years in advance for all of these shows. And it allowed for like such a creative freedom for the writers just to be like, let's dream big, and then, break it up into sections from there.
Yeah, I'm thinking too, like on that American Gods season 2, like I targeted 2 episodes to be more kind of Young Indy like, and when I really think about it, because one was like a flashback for one of the characters to like, it's like a Celtic kind of fantasy, storyline that, shows there's a character on who's a leprechaun, and it shows how he became a leprechaun. And it's a whole flashback episode. It takes you back there. And then another episode, which is kind of like a Scandal of 1920 episode, where you're in a club. There's a nightclub that the main character ran, and we had a big fan dance and singers and all that kind of stuff, just like George did. And it's interesting just thinking back. Like, I don't wonder if I would have done that had I not seen Young Indy and known that was an adjacent possible, because I hadn't really remembered that until I was like, oh yeah, I did that. I did one of those. And that's again, one of the nice things is being a writer on a show in charge of the season is you can kind of plan it out and you can target certain episodes to do certain things, in a great way. So you can often get that step out and get that separate experience. Whereas I think that was one thing that's a little weird watching Young Indy, right? Is because Indiana Jones is this adventurer, this hero who, runs around. And then it can feel jarring to suddenly see him Secret of Jazz or, Hollywood Follies or like, oh, that's not really why I want to see this character. And there's nothing in the story or the character that set this up as being something that would have been a part of his life. So it really doesn't feel earned or authentic to the character. It really, again, felt like George loves that stuff and he wanted to share it with the world. But it didn't really feel earned or necessary, really, and almost antithetical to the character.
It is that thing that they would often make references in the shows to stuff that we hadn't seen yet. So like some of those things we do see, and now you can watch it in its current format, and it seems pretty seamless. But at the time, it's like I think Mystery of the Blues in particular, he references spending time in New Orleans as a toddler, as a kid, and going to sleep listening to the music, overhead. And it's like, that's cool. That would have been a cool episode to see, but we never saw it. So it feels kind of out of place in the lexicon of Indiana Jones, because you're just like, oh, this is random. Like, we've never heard about this before. But that, it's again, that anthology format of just like, dropping in random pieces of information that maybe would get filled out later. But we never got to see that happen.
To your point, though, like, and I've made this joke on the show where it's like, you see Harrison Ford in Mystery of the Blues, and he, instead of talking about the Ark of the Covenant or whatever he might talk about, he's like,
well, here's a sacred relic of my past.
I do think that that George knows what he's doing. Like, he is mocking you.
The whole thing is the journey of the hero. I mean, the whole piece, you were just seeing a small part of it.
I am hoping if this works, if we get a good first weekend, there is a prequel and a sequel.
Is that true?
And they're better than this movie. It's a combat movie. Honesty, very honest with you, because normally I'm not.
No, I understand that.
This is as close as you'll ever get to episode 7.
He is sort of like, I like jazz, and I think you should like jazz, and I know you think this is the most badass guy in the world, but I'm just going to make him say he likes jazz, because I can. Because he's my character, and I can make him, he's like my puppet. I can make him say whatever I want. Look at Harrison Ford's lips, And I just think part of him just enjoys that. And I think that's why he does it.
Yeah.
But I also think it's that like conscious awareness that he is not a slave to the viewer. And to be fair, he has changed his creative directions at times based upon audience pushback. Famously, like the Metachlorians and the prequels were meant to be a much more important part of those 3 films, and instead they just drop. Jar Jar as well was meant to be much more of a presence, and then he dwindles away until he doesn't even have a line in Revenge of the Sith. But at the same time, I think he is like, he as Jesse, as you said earlier, it's like he's the audience of one. Like, if he wants to see something, he's going to do it.
Yeah, and he has a very specific taste. I love American Graffiti, and THX is rad, but Radioland Murders is not for me. And I don't know if you guys, have checked it out, but I
like it. It's
yeah. So I want to smoke whatever you're smoking, Peter, because my version of Radioland Murders is my favorite year. Is a movie that kind of takes place in this kind of the same arena,
sure,
but I think is potentially, maybe more relatable and relevant and creatively successful.
It was 1954. Television was live, and Benji Stone landed the job of his dreams as a TV comedy writer.
Flesh and blood, life size, no larger. I'm not that silly damned hero I never was.
To me, you were. You couldn't have convinced me unless you had that courage. Nobody's that good an actor.
I'm not an actor, I'm a movie star.
Radioland Murders is very, very specific and has a very specific taste and tone that George likes.
I feel like I like it maybe for the same reasons George likes it, in that like I love old time radio shows. Like I love that format and that medium so much. And when I look back at Radioland Murders, like that's mostly what I remember is the cutaways to the shots of them recording the radio programs.
Yeah.
I guess that's telling as to why that's what you remember, which I haven't seen the film. So this is something that we're building up to. Jonathan Hales shared his opinions on the film.
He did.
In my opinion, Radioland Murders is the worst movie I have ever seen in my life. It's absolutely rotten. It is a terrible picture.
Well, I told him that Peter and I we're gonna watch it, and I'm gonna record my thoughts live, and we'll see how this goes. But I'm very excited to do this.
That's look, because I'm a man of a certain age, so as a kid, I listened to LP records of old time radio.
Yeah,
I love old time radio. Captain Midnight, Doc Savage. I was a huge fan of those books. Like, I love that pulp era. It's one reason why Raiders, I think, resonated with me so significantly. And, and Lone Ranger, like, I love that, like, even Dragnet's a little different era, but that sense of, I don't know if it's corn or cheese or whatever, element is in that. It was just an interesting tone in Radioland Murders that I couldn't get in sync with and really aspired to.
You won't be sorry, Miss Henderson.
Mrs. Henderson. Her name is Mrs.
Right, Mr. Henderson.
Not now, Roger. I don't have time to be talked out of divorcing you.
Hiya, Roger. That's a swell suit. Oh, the dog says hello and say, what's that last thing? Oh, yes, my life has no meaning without you. Penny, this is me. Remember? The joint checking account, the little hairs on the sink, How can you throw away everything we have?
Had, Roger. Past tense. Speaking of tense, I'm busy. I'm trying to stay on top of things around here.
Well, I always liked you on top of things. He didn't let me finish.
It's that weird alchemy that it's hard to recreate, I think. Like when we look back at American Graffiti, it was so wildly successful because people viewed it as a nostalgia endorphin rush for that generation who grew up in the 50s. But when we look back on it today as a viewer, it's like the movie's very dark.
Oh, shit. How old are you?
Old enough. How old are you?
I'm too old for you.
Can't be that old.
Listen, I think you better go back and sit with your sister.
Like it is these characters are fucked up and they have problems.
You were leading up to something kind of big.
What I meant was that since we do care for each other so much, and since we should really consider ourselves as adults now, I thought maybe before I leave, we could agree that seeing other people while I'm away can't possibly hurt,
The reason it was so successful was kind of people wanting the happy days. Like they wanted that vibe. They wanted just like pure nostalgia. What George was giving them was an incredibly nuanced movie that in many, I don't know if people really connected with that nuance at the time. And then with Radioland Murders, I think George was trying to give people the nostalgia drip, the pure like cotton candy. But it just didn't resonate because people actually wanted the nuance at that point. I'm
going to go out on a limb and just say, I think, because American Graffiti is George's story. It's authentic.
Yeah.
Right? That is
absolutely
authentic. It has a naturalism to it. It's everything that Radioland Murders isn't.
It's a good point.
Good point. In a way that there's an inauthenticity to Radioland Murders that those jokes better kill.
Boy, I love radio, but I love a good pee even more.
Like, you better have the best jokes in the world, in this, because you're watching a very, false landscape and false world that you need to buy into. They're so different, and just some really. I love American Graffiti so much. George was such an amazing visual filmmaker and editor, and obviously his support team was as well. And I really am, part of that generation that remembers when George was like, "Now I'm going to go make all these other smaller movies. Now I'm going to go." It's like but he never did because he got divorced and took care of his kids, and he just, prioritized his life in a different way. He just never had the opportunity to make all those other smaller, more George Lucas-y movies, I think.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think the 80s period, I think part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is like there was that period in the 80s and into the 90s where he was still being very prolific, but a lot of people just don't remember those films.
Yeah.
Because I haven't seen Radioland Murders, but I have had to clip pieces of it for different episodes we've done on the podcast that are coming out. And one thing that strikes me, and we have a copy of an interview that the panel, George and Rick and people did in the 90s. And one of the things Rick says sort of nonchalantly, but I think there's a lot of truth when asked, how do you keep the budgets down? How did you make this show for so cheap? Because we save the money above the line.
How did you get such a look with so little money? What area did you cut back on that most production companies wouldn't?
Above the line.
And I think when you look at a movie like Radioland Murders, I think that's a movie that could have been helped by having a big star play the lead character who could bring their sensibility to the movie, perhaps, advocate for certain creative choices to protect that. Because in just the scenes I see of Brian Benben, who I'm sure is a great actor, a talented performer, he does seem kind of lost in the material. And I mean, I don't know if it's a Jim Carrey movie. Like, I don't know what that actor in 1994 is that you would put in that. But I could imagine if it was more of a star vehicle with a comedic sensibility of that star, I think that movie probably works better and lets that technology that they were making the movie in a different way. And I think that's fine. I think that works. And maybe you would have had a more creatively successful film. And the fact that George didn't direct it. And, maybe he needed to. Maybe if this was his idea and it's like, he's got it in his head and it works a very specific way, maybe he needed to go do that because no one else got it. Jonathan mentions that about Scandal in 1920, that George wanted Spielberg to direct it. He wanted it to be Spielberg's musical. Spielberg didn't. And then the director they got told Jonathan he didn't like musicals. And Jonathan's like, well, okay, I wish we could get someone to direct this that directed musicals. So a lot of that with these things, they're done on a budget, they're done efficiently. But maybe there are some creative sacrifices being made that do poison the well a little bit.
You know what? I think you're onto something about hiring talent. I think it was the director. I think what that movie needed was its Irvin Kershner. It needed that director who actually understood performance and connected to performance and could let George handle all the other bananas. But it's a performance issue and a tonal issue that in Radioland that is the director's responsibility. So, because I think the cast is significant. When I put it on a couple nights ago, I couldn't believe the cast.
Well, gentlemen, when you see the rest of the firepower that we have marshaled for you this evening, I'm going to expect you to do your duty and run out and enlist in my war against the other three networks.
I was like, oh my God. Like, there's a lot of really talented people in that movie that are maybe not delivering some of the most effective performances of their career. And I put a lot of that on whoever the director of that movie was. It was someone that I didn't recognize and may be very successful and talented, but maybe wasn't confident enough to push back or, in a way. And that's what I would that's where I would really, I don't want to call it blame because obviously you don't want to yuck somebody's yum. There are people that love Radioland Murders like George, but I think with a different director, you maybe could have had something that was relatable and relevant to a broader audience.
We should probably wrap things up here. I mean, Jesse, you've been so incredibly kind with your time. Is there any final thoughts on Young Indy that we haven't covered yet?
I think that show's incredible. I think, for the love of God, please, after listening to that Ben Burtt podcast, it sounds like there's elements that could be recovered by Disney and restored. And, I really hope that one day, whether it's through technology that has yet to be built or created, they can restore that show in a way that it lives on our high def screens in a way that we could go into Adobe Premiere right now and use AI to extend the aspect ratio of all those shots. This is kind of funny, and I'll just show it to you guys. This is a George Lucas autograph. Oh, wow. Right? And so a buddy of mine was hanging out with George, and was like, George, my friends are such huge fans. Will you do an autograph to my friend? And is he married? Yeah, he's married. Well, what if he gets divorced? Like, what the fuck? My buddy had just met him. So George signed, he has like 2 Jess, 2 Mare, so that when we get divorced, we can cut it in half. So, the reason that I'm sharing that with you is the divorce broke his heart. Like, that broke his heart. It changed his life. It changed his priorities for the, in a way that's amazing. He's such a great dad and but it was such a significant moment in his life that he, still carries with him. And it really shaped his art, I think, in a way. And, it's just something interesting that I feel like I have like proof of that.
Such a glib humor he has too. I love
That's an amazing souvenir, though.
Yeah.
And I hope you and your spouse stay together forever, so you have that on the wall, and you can tell that story in your very old age, because that's a great story.
Awesome. Totally. And I just want to say thank you to you guys for keeping Young Indy alive and bringing it back. Everybody, your interviews are amazing with all these people, learning so much about not just the show, but filmmaking and the industry in general. Your interviews are so insightful, and thank you for bringing it back to my attention, because I hadn't really thought about it in so long. And then the way that it's influencing my own projects. I have 2 projects right now where I'm totally ripping stuff off from Young Indy, from that ambition and some of that era and some of those, oh my God, they were really onto something. And I just want to thank you guys so much for making this show. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Jesse. And that's great to hear that, if Young Indy can stay alive in some ways through the projects of the future. That's fantastic. That's super cool. Do you have any socials you want to plug, or any upcoming projects you want to talk about?
Yeah, on social, I'm on, there's Instagram as Scribbler's Toolbox. I have a blog called scribblejerk.com, which is just filled with a lot of stuff that I've learned over the years. And nothing's behind a paywall. And it really is just for me to find ways to write down things that I know, so I put them in a place where I can see them and remember them. But I think people might be entertained and learn stuff from some of them. So yeah, Instagram, Scribbler's Toolbox, scribblejerk.com. I'm on LinkedIn under my own name, Jesse Alexander. And yeah, that's it.
That's fantastic. Awesome. Well, Jesse, thanks so much for being here again. This has been awesome. And if you want to get in touch with us, listeners out there, you can find us at Young Indy Pod on Instagram. Please rate us 5 stars. It really helps to get other people to find the show, and it also makes us feel good. So until next time, for Daniel and myself, keep on adventuring.
Next time on the Young Indy Chroniclers, we are thrilled to have production designer Gavin Bouquet here.
The production designer's job physically is to create everything you see around the actor. He suggested me to Norman Reynolds, who was just starting Jedi. I then did The History of the World with Mel Brooks. When I got Young Indy, I don't think George remembered me. I know George was very keen to bring the scale of film drama into the TV world. George has always said he makes independent films, hasn't he? He made the films he wanted to make.